We continue our last panel discussion with the theme International Cooperation for Developing a Green Society. The panel will be chaired by Professor Toshi Arimura, Professor of Waseda University, and we have 5 panelists for this session. Mr. Hirohide Hirai, Vice Minister for International Affairs, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. Ms. Birgit Schwenk, Director General for Climate Action of the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, Germany, who is joining us online. Mr. Peter Bakker, President and CEO of World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Mr. Takao Aiba, Project General Manager, Environment Affairs and Engineering Management Division of Toyota Motor Corporation. And Dr. Raymond Kopp, Senior Fellow of Resources for the Future, USA. The panel discussion starts with the opening remarks from the chair, Professor Toshi Arimura. So please have a seat. Thank you. So Professor Arimura, please.
Okay. Thank you for a nice introduction. This is the final session of the Global Green Transformation Conference here at Tokyo. And it's my honor to be a chair of this final panel today with these great panelists. I'm Toshi Arimura, Professor of Environmental Economics at Waseda University, and currently serving as a president of the Japanese Association of Environmental Economics and Policy Study. And I have been doing a research on carbon pricing and carbon leakage, and naturally economic analysis of a border adjustment mechanism. At the same time, I have done some research on the cooperation between developed countries and developing countries, including joint crediting mechanism. So I think that's why I have become the chair for this session. And this session will start with my background presentation. But before getting into that, I would like to review the structure of today's this panel. So after my background talk, I will invite Dr. Kopp as a keynote speaker for this session. Then we'll have 2-round questions. And Ms. Schwenk will be joining us in 15 minutes later. So she'll be still somewhere, and so we'll be waiting. So that's the structure of this panel. Okay, so then let me start on the background of the sessions. So climate change is a global issue. So therefore, the effort from both developed and developing countries are necessary. However, developing countries often lack resources to address these issues. So therefore, the international cooperation between developing and developing economies are important. And that is the theme of these sessions. And the latest findings of IPCC highlighted the increased urgency to act for limiting global warming to 1 degrees Celsius. To do so, we must have peaked emissions somewhere between 2020 and 2025, and we have to reduce greenhouse gas by around 43% by 2030. And finally, we must achieve carbon neutrality around 2050. And more than 105 countries have announced a net zero emission goal so far. And among them, 140 countries set their target year by 2050. But at the same time, some major emitters have different target years. And in the field of this climate change, CBDL, Common But Differential Responsibility, has been one important essence of the international negotiations. So based on that, Kyoto Protocol was born, but it has some limitations. And learning from Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement made a great progress. Under the Paris Agreement, as you know, that both developed countries and developing countries set their own numerical goals. It's not mandatory, but each country now has its own goals, and it's set by each country. So that is a big progress for the international society. But recently, at the G20 Environmental Climate Ministerial meeting this year, the outcome was not a unanimously endorsed communique. Instead, they issued a chair's summary. The Indonesian presidency explained this result coming from the lack of flexibility in some countries. So we observe some divisions. However, this division does not hold ambitious policies and actions, especially in the developed countries. And this year, Germany took the lead for the G7 presidency, and ambitious outcomes were achieved, including the industrial decarbonization and several climate initiatives. And some developed countries take actions to achieve their goals. At the same time, they take their policy to harmonize or ensure a level playing field, occurring from the difference in the ambition between countries. For example, a European Union that has implemented the EU ETS now is proposing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which has become the topics today several times. So that's one movement from the European Union. At the same time, we know that there is a similar discussion in the United States, the Senate and the Congress. And there is also a discussion on climate clubs under the German leadership. So it is important for developing countries to keep on taking the lead in climate action. But the question is how we can enhance cooperation between the developed countries and developing countries. And we must encourage global action in developing countries, and it is an essential question to be solved. And it is important to understand the difference in circumstances that between developed and developing countries. And in this panel, we aim to discuss for a positive way forward of international cooperation for developing green society. So that's the background for this panel. And now I would like to introduce the keynote speakers for this panel. Dr. Raymond Kopp from Resources for the Future. The Resources for the Future is the leading research institute of environmental economics and policy in the US, and they have been leading the US discussion for decades. And Dr. Kopp is the leading environmental economist in that institute. So we are lucky to have him here today. So please join me to give him a big hand, Dr. Kopp. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Great pleasure to visit Japan once again, and I look forward to the conversation that we have. I'm going to be focusing my remarks on global industry, primarily the manufacturing sector, and talking about greening up that sector, which means, of course, reducing the emissions from global industry over a period of time. Next slide, please. So I don't think it comes as any surprise to anyone in this room or online that industry now represents a large share of emissions. In my country alone, industry is about a quarter of our U.S. emissions. I think the same is true in the EU, and it could be a larger share of emissions here in Japan. In developed economies, Japan and the U.S., other members of the G7, industry drives economic activity, it drives employment, and it drives the creation of wealth. That is the positive side of that activity that does give rise to those emissions. For many of the sectors in manufacturing, they exchange commodities and products on highly competitive international markets. So when one thinks about designing policies to reduce the emissions from the industrial sector, one has to keep in mind that as those policies are put forward, it has become a political and economic priority to maintain the domestic competitiveness of those industries as you decarbonize. When we think about greening global industry, I think about it in a couple of different ways. One, we've already heard throughout today the need for new and low-carbon technologies, and those must be developed. But also we heard today about the significant amount of financial resources that are going to have to be put in place to invest in those technologies, perhaps even the ones that are close to commercialization now. Those are large sums of money. For those investments to take place, particularly by the private sector, there has to be a demand for the products of those green industries, which means there needs to be the creation of large-scale products, large-scale markets for these green industries going forward. Finally, the idea of harmonization, cooperation, collaboration is necessary because we're trying to do a couple things at once. One, we are decarbonizing a very complex system with supply chains that extend globally. We're drawing on technologies from many different countries going forward. And we're trying to do that in a way where we individually, country by country, maintain the competitiveness of our activities in our industries going forward. To me, that suggests the need for certainly global cooperation. To the extent that we can harmonize those policies, that would be great. But we do need to collaborate on a global scale to be able to bring forward the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that we all want. Next slide, please. So what I hope to do in a few minutes today is give you a bit of a perspective from the U.S. I'll talk a little bit about kind of where we are in the U.S. with respect to decarbonizing industrial emissions. And then I'll look a little bit to the future beyond what has already been done to where I think the U.S. Congress is headed and what's going to be necessary to put additional bits and pieces of policy in place. So recently in August, the U.S. passed something called the Inflation Reduction Act, kind of an odd name for a particular policy, but that's the politics of the U.S. And it is certainly the most significant piece of climate legislation in the last 2 decades. Some of my colleagues say the most significant piece ever for the United States. It cuts across every single sector of the U.S. economy, and it does pay particular attention to U.S. industry. It provides loans, grants, and tax credits of very large magnitude to expand and retool the U.S. manufacturing sector and to aid in its decarbonization. And so we should not overlook the scale of the dollars that are going into those loans, grants, and tax credits to really move the needle on industrial decarbonization. Importantly, it uses government procurement in a variety of different agencies to stimulate the demand for the products from these sectors, most particularly right now in construction materials. The U.S., through the earlier piece of legislation that focused on infrastructure, is going to be purchasing an enormous amount of steel and cement, and it is doing that in a fashion that really weights heavily the carbon intensity of those particular products and provides markets for that. The Inflation Reduction Act does something else that I think is really quite important, and that is it begins the process of developing standardized and transparent ways of talking about green products. You've all heard about environmental product declarations. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has been awarded a large amount of money to develop rigorous guidelines and principles for putting environmental declarations together and helping then to establish product labeling that can be used to further the green markets going forward. So kind of in sum, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, will reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the United States to a great extent. It does it without adding any particular carbon prices to the system. So my friends would say it's all about carrots and not about sticks. It is about government grants, tax credits, and loan guarantees to move the needle going forward. Next slide, please. So let's look back. That's the past. We are now already into the future. And these are some reflections, these 4 bullets that you see, kind of my personal assessment of where I think the U.S. Congress sits right now. both Democrats and Republicans. And I can't say that they're all moving in the same direction, but there are some perceptions that Congress has that I think are generalizable across those parties. I think the first is, and one of the most important, the belief that the U.S., Japan, other G7 countries are taking substantial steps to decarbonize its industrial sector. But other nations engaged in international trade with these same countries taking on large reduction efforts are lagging behind in their moves to decarbonize their sector. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that the U.S. Congress is keenly aware of the importance of maintaining the industrial competitiveness of the U.S. for those reasons I mentioned on the first slide: employment, wealth creation, basic economic activity. Those things are huge economic drivers from the U.S. economy and have obviously a tremendous amount of political priority associated with it. Third, I think it's safe to say that the faith that the Paris Agreement or the broader UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, really is not up to the task to reduce what is perceived to be this imbalance with respect to the actions that countries like the G7 are taking and other countries that are not taking aggressive actions. And so what is this? I think the same thing is true for the WTO, by the way, the World Trade Organization. I don't think there's a lot of faith that the WTO is going to come to the rescue here and help to correct this imbalance. And so what that leaves us with, at least in the U.S., is a belief that there's going to need to be bilateral or multilateral action taken, as I say, by like-minded nations that are moving to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and that those nations are going to need to develop new policies and measures that are going to help deal with this perceived imbalance. Next slide, please. So, new possible legislation in 2023. And this is something that I think we can say with some certainty is discussions are taking place. These are discussions that are taking place between both Democrats and Republicans, which is crucially important. If there's going to be new legislation in 2023 that is going to support continued decarbonization in the United States, it will almost certainly have to be bipartisan. And that means, in addition to 50 Democratic senators, at least the ones that are in office right now until the election comes in November, you're going to need another 10 Republicans online. So those conversations have to be bipartisan. Obviously, those different parties come to this with different priorities, but those conversations are taking place. The idea is to build legislation that would continue to support the further decarbonization of U.S. industry. And when we say the further decarbonization, what we really mean is that there's going to be costs involved in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's going to be a supporting system of policies to enable those costs to be borne by the industry and still protect the competitiveness of the industry as it decarbonizes. That legislation will likely have incentives in it to increase the ambition of other nations that we believe, the U.S. believes, are not acting in a manner that is consistent with global decarbonization. The fourth piece is something that really kind of comes out of COVID, but has now been exemplified or further enhanced by the war in Ukraine and energy security, and that's the opportunity to strengthen supply chains among, again, what I call like-minded nations. These would be nations that share similar political and economic systems, are trusted and transparent. And the idea would be that you want to facilitate the further enhancement and deepening of supply chains among those nations. Next slide. So when we think about that legislation, what is the kind of the cornerstone of that or the foundation of that particular legislation? It's almost certain to be a focus on what I call environmental performance, and that is defined as the greenhouse gas intensity of commodities and products, often referred to as embodied carbon. The greenhouse gas intensity is a measure of environmental performance, and it has already been incorporated in 2 pieces of legislation that have been proposed in the Senate. Neither of those pieces of legislation is moving forward, but bits and pieces might get picked up in additional action taken in the next few months. But they do focus on the environmental performance as a measure of the U.S. Decarbonization and a way to gauge the performance of countries that wish to export goods into the U.S. Unlike the European Union CBAM, which we've probably talked about quite a bit today, these border measures do not, or these policies which have border measures involved, do not focus on any particular regulatory policy of a country exporting goods to the U.S. They focus exclusively on the environmental performance of those particular products. The most detailed proposal, the Clean Competition Act, proposed by Senator Whitehouse and Senator Schatz, imposes no tariffs on any nation exporting commodities or products to the U.S. that have greenhouse gas intensities below the mean intensity for U.S. manufacturers. So if you're country X and you're producing aluminum and your greenhouse gas intensity, tons of CO2 per ton of aluminum, is below the mean in the U.S., you would face no tariffs whatsoever. If it's above the mean, you would face a tariff on the margin of tons above that particular benchmark. So in a sense, this proposal, the Clean Competition Act, would establish an environmental performance customs union, in a sense, composed of the U.S. and high environmental performing trading partners. Without stating it's a customs union, it would be a customs union in the sense that if you had benchmark intensities below the U.S., you would be paying no tariffs. There would be essentially free trade going forward. If you had intensities above that, then you, of course, you would be paying tariffs. So let me stop there. We can talk more during the questions that will be posed to the panel around actions that can be taken to enhance collaboration, to build cooperation and harmonization through perhaps clubs and alliances. But thank you for your time right now, and I will turn the floor back to Mr. O'Brien. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much sharing the recent development in the U.S. and also sharing the different perspective on the level playing field. So now I would like to move to the opening remarks to from each panelist. And first, I would like to invite Mr. Hirai from the Ministry of Economy and Trade and Industries. He's the Vice Minister for the International Affairs. And how do you see the global landscape of ambitions and actions toward climate issues?
Thank you, Chairman. So I'm Hirohide Hirai, as was introduced, the Vice Minister for International Affairs of Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. So first, I would like to start by touching upon the recent international situation regarding climate change. So the Paris Agreement, to which all member countries of the United Nations have agreed, calls for holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade, above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial level. According to the IPCC, the current temperature increase has already reached 1.1 degrees centigrade compared to the pre-industrial era, and the effects are already visible. The panel is showing us the example, like the frequency of the droughts has increased by 1.7 times, and the frequency of the heavy rainfall by 1.3 times. And the panel further highlighted their estimate that if the temperatures were to rise to 2 degrees in the future, then The frequency of the droughts would increase by 2.4 times and for heavy rainfall by 1.7 times. Next slide, please. In light of this scientific background, more than 140 countries around the world have committed to net zero emission by 2050. If you include the countries committed to net zero emission and carbon neutrality by 2060 or 2070, the number will increase to more than 150 countries. Next slide, please. In order to achieve these ambitious goals, the concrete actions are becoming increasingly important. There are 3 points that we should be aware of here. First, G7 countries account for 30% of global emissions, while the G20 countries account for 80%. This clearly explains the necessity of action from all countries, including developing countries. The second point is that the marginal abatement cost, in other words, the cost of reducing CO2 emissions, differs from country to country, which means that the efficient reduction can be achieved through international corporations. And the third, each country is in a different circumstances and faces climate change differently. Availability of advanced technology, endowment of its domestic natural resources, accessibility to the sea, and vulnerability to the climate change, those are the examples which varies from country to country. In the area of climate change, common but differentiated responsibility, as known as CBDR, is a common phrase. Developing countries are strongly demanding historical responsibility from developed countries. According to my colleague who participated in the G20 Joint Environment Climate Ministers meeting last month, the positions of developed and developing countries were far apart at this time. Next slide, please. The world is in the midst of the crisis of energy security. Energy demand is increasing at an accelerated pace, especially in emerging economies, while the divestment movement has resulted in the steady decrease in fossil fuel upstream investment, both of which has resulted in resource shortages. Oil and natural gas prices have reached unprecedented levels, which are depressing economic growth in many countries, including developed countries. Moreover, the soaring energy prices is causing backslides from the decarbonization through a return to coal-fired power generations. Japan believes in a role to promote international cooperation that bridges the developed and the developing countries. The key phrases is to achieve both economic growth and emission reductions. I believe the sharing of concept of green transformation, which is to transform the society to achieve both economic growth and emission reduction, is the way forward for international cooperation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing this a big landscape of the climate change actions. Well, now Ms. Schwenk from German Director General is just on time. I'm not sure if she's ready to make some comments. Are you ready?
I am, yes, I am.
Okay, I'm the chair of the session. I'm Toshi Arimura. Well, I'm just surprised that you just on time, just on time. Okay, so here is my question to you. As this year's G7's presidency, how do you see this year's G7's outcomes, especially focusing on industrial decarbonizations and international corporations, such as IDA or climate clubs? So are you ready to share your view?
Of course, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very important conference. And I must congratulate Japan actually for this conference and the whole process that Japan has started on the green transformation. I think that this is actually also a very good starter for handing over the G7 presidency from our side to your side. So I'm very, very pleased and very honored to be able to speak here. And I was actually not on time, for which I apologize. I had an important meeting with our minister just before, which took a bit longer. But I was fortunately in the position of listening to Harai-san's intervention just now, which explained very well the double crisis that we are in at the moment, with energy security being a very harsh issue for many of us at the moment, also Germany, due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And but also the climate crisis, of course, which challenge you have presented very well as well. This doesn't go away, but rather we have to deal with both at the same time. And I'm glad to say that all the G7 in our G7 presidency so far have made it very clear that we stick to our climate goals, and that even we have to accelerate the energy transition. This has to be part of the solution to this energy crisis, and all the G7 have agreed on this very important point. For instance, we had a commitment, or have a very new commitment of the G7, which committed to an overwhelmingly or even fully decarbonized power sector by 2035. Also including action towards an accelerated coal phase-out. So we have very clear commitment for a fundamental transformation in the direction of climate neutrality. And this, of course, encompasses industry. So the transformation of industry towards green production processes, greener carbon neutral production processes or low carbon production processes is really key. And I'm very glad to say that in our presidency, we have already made quite a bit of progress on this important issue, having worked on the basis of the industrial decarbonization agenda, which existed before, but I think we've given it a few more steps, more concrete steps to follow on. And for instance, I'm really very glad, or this is a major development, which has been taken by all the G7, also including Japan, that we have now agreed to definitions and emission thresholds for near zero CO2 steel and cement production in an annex to the ministerial declaration of the Environment, Climate and Energy Ministers in the G7 in May. And there are also recommendations for a policy toolbox, different instruments that could be taken by countries towards that goal of decarbonizing industry. And we have built our efforts on an IEA report. The International Energy Agency has presented a report to us as a G7 called Achieving Net Zero Heavy Industry Sectors in G7 members, which was extremely helpful and for our work in the G7, containing a quite elegant proposal, we think, on the definition of the near zero production of steel and cement. And if I may say so, if you have the time to look into this report, I can really recommend it. It's very clear and very informative. So we use the format of the G7 industry decarbonization agenda to advance the technical work, but also the recommendations for the toolbox. And I hope that we have a strong contribution here towards the creation of an economic and a policy environment that incentivizes investment in green and low carbon manufacturing in industry. So a very good starting point, I think, for further international cooperation, which is being taken up already in such international initiatives, for instance, as the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial and the UNIDO. So we hope to be working together very much with these other fora, but also, of course, we hope that Japan, or are actually quite optimistic that Japan will take forward this work as well next year. So I think a very good thing to hand over by the end of this year to the next G7 presidency. And the second initiative that you've mentioned in your question is the Climate Club, which has been proposed by our Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, right in the beginning of our G7 presidency in the beginning of the year. And this has been agreed on at the G7 summit, that we want to work on the establishment of an open, a cooperative and inclusive climate club with a view to establishing this by the end of the year. And at the moment, we are working on the further development of the concept together with our G7 partners. We are going to hold task force meetings of the G7 before the end of the year, hoping to reach agreement on terms of reference that we can then also pass on to the work of the next presidencies. Given that this is a German proposal, of course, we'll help move this forward as well. And a strong focus of the Climate Club will be on accelerating industry decarbonization. So we are looking at 3 pillars of contents of the Climate Club. Apart from, as I said, the strong focus on decarbonizing industry, we're also having work on promoting ambitious and transparent climate action to reduce emissions intensity, which is another subject here of this session, and also to move forward with international partnerships. So in the terms of partnerships, we are also involving others beyond the G7 into our discussions, consulting with them of what parts of the Climate Club would be most interested for partners to work with us on. And I'll leave it at that for a first intervention. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing new development, the concrete development under German initiatives. Okay, now I would like to invite Mr. Peter Becker from WCSD. You are having a very busy day today. In every session, you are on the panel. I really appreciate your hard work. And so, as the world-leading CEOs and lead, of the WCSD, so what are the WCSD's view related to industrial decarbonizations? It's a broad question, but I
can go anywhere with that question. That's good. No, I think business, generally speaking, acts on facts. So the slides that were shown on the world of 1.5 degrees, the world of 2 degrees, are always very carefully studied by business, and they've been translated in what is called the science-based targets for climate. And we're now also working on science-based targets for nature. To add to the slides that were shown, we're also now studying the latest science that only came out a month ago on the tipping points. And that indicates that 4 natural tipping points, are about to tip when the world hits 1.5 degrees Celsius, meaning at that point, 10-meter sea level rise will be irreversible. So where maybe sometimes in the discussions, people think that 1.5 degrees is the ambition, but it will be too hard to realize, and maybe 2 degrees would be fine too. The latest science is actually telling us we need to hit no more than 1.5 degrees if we want to keep the world safe, but in terms of business, if we want to keep supply chains resilient. Because already this summer we've seen in many parts of the world what climate impacts does when rivers dry up or countries flood or major disruptions in weather events cause trouble. And so traditionally business has looked at this through the lens of risk. What can we do to integrate environmental risks into our risk assessments? What can we do to create decarbonization plans? So I'm very happy to report that there are now 8,500 companies in the world that have committed to science-based targets, that have set net zero commitments by no later than 2050, and that are trying to halve their emissions by 2030, just as the 1.5 degree pathway from science has indicated. The reality behind that, though, is if you look at those 8,500 companies, how many of those actually have operating plans in place that will deliver those commitments? And the answer there is a bit more sobering. It's less than half of the companies who have plans in place like that. So the message here is, and I think that will be the theme for 2023 in business contributions to COP27 in a few weeks, but certainly to COP28 when it goes to the UAE, is about action and accountability. So a commitment is great. That's the start of a journey for any business. But accountability on whether you are actually making progress to deliver those targets is what is going to be the next big step that business needs to embrace. And I think the realization in business is now universal that we need to talk about system transformation, or as in the Global Green Transformation Conference, the green transformation. This is not just about reducing the emissions from one plant or one product. We really need to think about changing the whole system, the supply chains, the way we talk to investors, the way we train our people, the products we put onto the market. And that requires radical collaboration. Maybe a few years ago, a company would set its own emission reduction targets and leave it at that. Now companies are thinking about how do we restructure our value chain? Because we all know that only when a chain from raw product to end of life is sustainable or gets to net zero, will the world be able to deliver its target of net zero by no later than 2050. So the deepest amount of work at the moment is around Scope 3 accounting. How do we actually measure the emissions across all chains, all companies and all suppliers into a value chain? And again, that is one of those drivers of radical collaboration that you now begin to see emerge in the business society. When it comes to the international process, the COP process, if you like, I do not envy the position of people who are running governments, because both the polarization in some countries, but certainly the geopolitical agenda between countries does not always make it easy to create one common global answer. But I think business can be helpful there, because business runs global supply chains with raw materials coming from all around the world. The big businesses, in any case that we work with, sell their products in many markets, and as such will be looking for universal acceleration of climate action. So I think what I'm hoping to achieve, certainly for COP28, is work very closely with governments like METI here in Japan, but certainly also continue to work with the UNFCCC to bring what is business doing, not in terms of just commitments and promises, but in terms of action, in terms of innovation, with the avoided emission discussion we had in the prior panel, but then also with very strong accountability mechanisms in the ISSB disclosure frameworks, in the SEC disclosure rulings that are still in the making, to show that it's not just talk, but there is real action and real emission reductions underway.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing a very strong commitment to the climate. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Aiba from Toyota Motor Corporations. He has actually a presentation to make. So I think you can either go there or... Is the slide ready? Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Takawa of Toyota Motor Corporation. And first of all, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to METI and all organizers inviting me this very precious panel discussion. And thank you very much. And Toyota is one of the largest car company and selling car in more than 200 countries. And we are very much keen on environmental issues. And we announced Toyota Environmental Challenge 2050 in 2015, and more than 5 years ago. And first of all, I'd like to explain our basic policy toward carbon neutrality. And Toyota has committed to make every effort to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. As we are selling or working in more than 200 countries, we think approaches to carbon neutrality differ in countries with different energy mix. And now we should expand options for carbon neutrality in each step of energy produced, delivered, and used. It's very much important. And also we think as a company, we should preserve or provide employment in auto-related industry is quite essential. Next, please. And this is the past achievement of Japan's automotive sectors. As I said, in Japan, we are using diversified electrified vehicle, including hybrid electric vehicle or plug-in hybrid and electric vehicle. And we introduced such an electrified vehicle from early 20s. And now the market share reached around 40%. And the stock of electrified vehicle among our around 70 to 80 million vehicle is almost 20%. And then we are very much successful to reducing carbon dioxide emission from all sectors. But other counterparts of G7 seem to be a little bit struggling to reduce automotive sector emissions. But we think the diversified powertrain usage is quite essential. Next, please. And I think also the life cycle perspective or life cycle analysis is quite important. As IPCC latest reports say that battery electric vehicle with low carbon electricity has largest CO2 reduction potential. But if battery electric vehicle is propelled by the gas-fired electricity or coal-fired electricity, the emission reduction amount seems to be significantly reduced. So then the combination of electricity and powertrain is quite essential. And also, if we can use sustainable biofuel and combined with hybrid electric vehicle, the emission intensity is as low as almost same as battery electric vehicle. So maybe such kind of combination is quite important. Next, please. And also, this is an example of life cycle assessment. And please see the blue part of the diagram, and actually it's mean the vehicle production phase emissions. It's not so small actually, and in case of battery electric vehicle, the emission from production phase is significant because of the battery production is very energy intensive, so use a large amount of electricity. So we need to also pay attention to that phase of reduction. Next, please. And to reduce such kind of production phase emissions, electricity, carbon intensity is quite important. But the electricity generation mix differ country by country. And the left-hand side, Europe, green is renewable energy and yellow is nuclear. So there's such a clean energy portion is more than 50%. And also Canada, more than 50% renewable. So these two countries or region has competitive advantage in terms of low carbon electricity. But in Asian countries are not blessed with renewable energy resources, so their carbon intensity of energy is rather high. So they are trying to reduce, but the speed is different. So then we need to think about the suitable methodology with the pace of decarbonization of electricity. Next, please. Also, we need to pay attention to the selected key minerals, which is necessary for electrification of vehicles. And the left-hand side is an extraction side, and so copper, nickel, cobalt, and so top three country is so quite diverse. But in case of processing of such minerals, so very limited number of countries are dominant. So we need to think about diversify of the source of such mineral processing phase, and also so how to sustainably use the minerals. Actually, now the dramatically increase in the electrified vehicles, so demand, and the current mines cannot supply the enough amount of so minerals. So then maybe around 2024, so we need to develop more mines, and which may involve some environmental damage. So then we need to maintain the environmental protection, and also include this mineral, and also diversify the source is quite essential. Next, please. So then, also currently the Inflation Reduction Act, and also the CBAM of EU will be introduced, and so that may cause some obstacle to free trade. And then in that circumstances, maybe I raise 5 points to think about, to evaluate, and is it really good for planet? Or from business point of view, such as a trade mechanism place additional uncertainty. So now it's not so clear. So where we can sell a car. So when we produce one vehicle in some country, because of some trade measure may prohibit or block the export, and so then we need to care about the detail of such a trade measure. Also, such a trade measure is quite complex, and to simplify the mechanism, so may use average carbon intensity of electricity also, and some cases it may discourage a company located in country with very high carbon intensity electricity to reduce the carbon intensity of electricity to invest in renewable energy and so on. Even though they invest more and cost more and they reduce renewable energy, but if they reduce the emission reduction, intensity is not reflected to trade measures evaluation, so that such company may lose the incentive to do more. So such kind of adverse selection could be possible. So we need to care about. Also the customer's benefit, and generally trade policy ignore the benefit of customer. The customer will be forced to buy higher price product, and limited competition. So then we need to carefully evaluate impact on customers. And also no one left behind concept is quite important. So if such a rule is just benefit for the company located in country with renewable energy resources, and also disadvantages the country located in with limited renewable energy resources, it's not so fair sometimes. And so we need to care about. Also sometimes rich countries buy up all precious resources. So then such kind of situation is not ideal. So we need to encourage the sustainable development of companies in developing countries also. So then I think WTO or free trade principle is quite essential, and as fair as possible. Such a trade measure, and may minimize the interventions. And in the sense we should also think about such a policy is whether it's the best available policy measure or not. So to minimize such a negative side effect of policy. So the first question of the Arima-san is maybe current situation. So the energy price is very high, and so then we think the importance of diversification of energy or energy security is quite so increasing. And so now also the uncertainty for the future is increasing. So then it's not so good. And so we need clarification and the predictability of the future energy policy and emission reduction policy. It's very essential to induce international collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing the environmental performances for different vehicles and also sharing your personal view on the border measures. Now I would like to invite Dr. Kopp, your view on the carbon pricing-based approach and carbon intensity-based approach for policy harmonization. Maybe you can do it in 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. I wish someone else was going to answer that question for me, but I will take an attempt at it. I think truth in advertising, I'm an economist. I have worked on carbon pricing for at least 30 years under the assumption that it is the most efficient and effective means to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So just put that marker down there. So if I talk a little bit with a negative tone about carbon pricing, it's not because I wasn't trained otherwise. Within the U.S., it's other than the states, California in particular, and the northeastern states, there is no federal carbon price. And I think it's safe to say there will not be a federal carbon price in the near future. Some of you may have seen the methane fee, which was included in the Inflation Reduction Act, and we can talk a little bit about that. But among Republicans, it's not called a price at all. So there is no carbon price. Everything in the Inflation Reduction Act that moves climate policy forward is a carrot. They are government revenues that are used to move the dial. So that's number one. Number two, I think when the U.S. thinks about greenhouse gas reductions, it's often heard that, at least among members of Congress, that the climate doesn't care what policy you have in place to reduce emissions. It only cares about the reduction in emissions. And that's meant to say that, every country ought to be able to choose its own particular regulatory structure that fits its own particular circumstances, politics, economics, and what have you, as long as it maintains an aggressive stance in reducing emissions. So that's why you see within some of the Senate-passed legislation a focus on environmental performance measured as a greenhouse gas intensity measure with respect to manufactured products. That is an approach that at least measures the performance of your policies kind of going forward. And so you could look at the Inflation Reduction Act, and if you had sufficient models, you could see how that would change the greenhouse gas intensity of manufacturing going forward. As I said, I think in my opening remarks, new policies that may come forward embodied in new legislation almost certainly will have as a foundation for those policies, whether they're going to be border measures or whether they're going to be additional measures to reduce the intensity of greenhouse gases. It's going to be a performance-based system where performance, again, is measured by the greenhouse gas intensity of products. So why don't I stop there?
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your view on the performance-based approach. So we would like to move to the second round, but we are kind of behind the schedule. So I would like to ask you to be 3 minutes, have 3 minutes. And I would like to start from Ms. Schuvenk. Okay. And, so we see some divisions among the developed countries and some different positions between developed and developing countries. And Ms. Schuvenk, you already shared the cooperation among the developed countries. I would like to have to hear from you on how to promote cooperation between developed and developing countries from a German perspective.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. even if I have only 3 minutes, may I take a quick reaction as the European Union member here to what has been said on carbon pricing and the CBAM? Just a very brief reaction, because it's been prompted by the statements that we've had before. So the European Union has just adopted a very ambitious Fit for 55 package, which includes a number of measures that we are taking on climate action. So this should be seen really as part of this package. And we believe that direct carbon pricing is just a very efficient way of moving actors. And I'm saying actors because it really involves a lot of actors towards, let's say, internalizing the devastating effects of climate change. So carbon pricing is, in our belief, the central element with which we can move forward in the market. So we are, of course, looking at the comparability also with carbon intensity or other concepts. And this is also something that we've looked at in the G7 presidency, that we are looking at in the Climate Club. So we're not saying that this is the only way to go forward, the direct carbon pricing. But yes, in terms of the comparability, there remain things, a lot of issues to be looked at, to be clarified. And we have to, of course, address the problem of carbon leakage as well, because the climate is not helped if then the emissions are just moving to other countries. And I'm saying this in a completely neutral way, not referring to any specific countries. And it's good if we're all taking measures towards the same goal. So we have to work on this. But yeah, coming to your question properly, I mean, we've seen that it has to be a global effort to reduce emissions if we want to achieve climate goals. It can be only done with basically the whole world involved, and the G20, as has been shown, are the major emitters. So we have to work and take action in the G20 collectively. So as part of this, we have to move away from fossil fuels. Otherwise, we will not be able to keep 1.5 degrees in reach. That's for sure. I'm very happy that both us as the G7 presidency and also Indonesia as the current G20 presidency have made accelerating the energy transition a priority this year. So we know that the developing world and the global south, they are facing multiple crises at the moment. So we know that the challenge is even harder for them, a lot harder for them. They have a food crisis to deal with as well, prompted by the development with the Russian war and the ensuing energy crisis. And of course, there is this, in a way, injustice that they're feeling the consequences of global warming very much. So we are going to work very closely with our partners all over the globe. And of course, on an equal footing, that's for sure. What we have to talk about is really financing. Well, first of all, the G7 really stand with their commitment of deliver $100 billion of climate financing a year. We want to accelerate that. We have decided that the developed countries have decided that we are going to put forward a progress report ahead of COP27. So there is intensive work on that. We are working on just energy transition partnerships, as sort of a new plurilateral way of working together with developing countries. So a model has been set with South Africa, and we're working on other such partnerships. But these are, of course, not the only partnerships that we're working on. And we have to make sure that financial flows also in the private sector go towards the energy transition. And we can see that in industrialized countries, there is already a move for economic reasons, because it's just worthwhile to invest in renewable energies. But in the global south, this has been more difficult, and there has been there is a lot of reliance on public financing, and we have to make sure that we manage to get the private sector in here more. And then we are hoping for an ambitious approach also of the multilateral development banks. So more actors need to get involved here. The developed countries have to do their homework, definitely. But we have to move the whole system, I think. And it's important to be in regular fora of communication, to work closely, to have projects. We, for instance, have the International Climate Initiative, where we are working very closely with partner countries. But actually, we have to include the whole variety of stakeholders as well. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite Mr. Becker. I would like to hear from you the role of a business sector to promote global cooperation between developed countries and developing countries. Yeah, can you do that in 3 or 4 minutes?
Yeah, of course. Just responding to the previous speaker, I think the engine of the transformation will, for the next few years, be between business and the capital markets. And that's not to say that without governments we can solve the problem of climate change, but I think we really need to push hard now, and this is where government can immediately help. The ISSB disclosure rules for disclosing climate-related impacts need to become global baseline, used everywhere. I know here in Japan, the Japan Sustainability Standards Board are incorporating those into their thinking at the moment, but it needs to become a global baseline. It needs to then be made mandatory in as many countries as we can, because then immediately business will be held accountable according to standardized, materiality-based, comparable standards on what the progress is they're making towards decarbonization. I think if we can achieve that, then it's no longer dependent on a CEO making a commitment. It becomes the accounting rule by which we hold business accountable for the progress they're making. That's a very simple intervention for governments to make. It's not political, it's just an accounting rule, just like we have financial accounting rules. That will mobilize business, but furthermore, it will provide the information that investors and financiers need to then say which company is actually making the progress, and therefore provide these companies with lower cost of capital so that they get more funds to accelerate the solutions that they bring forward. I think the same logic will apply on the role of business in developing markets. We need to start thinking what are the solutions, and the avoided emission conversation can be applied there as well, that we can implement at cost levels that developing markets can afford. I think one of the new initiatives that came out of the Climate Week 2 weeks ago is the Global Africa Growth Initiative. How can we make sure that the known population growth in Africa will be a green growth, a green transformation? What technologies can business make available? What products and solutions can we make available so that Africa grows, which in 20 years will have 1 in 4 people in the world? And if we can plan now to make that growth sustainable growth with solutions that the African population can afford, then we build Africa as an example of developing markets into a green transformation, rather than first putting the wrong system in place and having to change it later.
Thank you very much. Thank you for very punctual. Now, in the interest of time, actually, I would like to invite Mr. Hirai's Meti's view towards realizing global green transformation and the future prospects for cooperation among the developed and the developing countries.
Thank you. I'll try to be very short. So let me explain our reports. First, I would like to introduce the Asian Energy Transition Initiative in relation to the involvement of developing countries. In my previous answer, I mentioned the need to take into consideration the different circumstances in each country. Through the AT, we call the Asian Energy Transition Initiative, we are supporting the developing a roadmap towards net zero emissions while taking into account the situation in each developing countries. And we are also supporting to training human resources on expertise related to energy transition. In addition, private financial institutions in Asia, Europe, and the US have held discussions and a proposal of the guideline to support finance for the steady transition in Asia was developed just last week. In addition, Area Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia presented 10 transition technologies that will contribute to energy transition. These are tangible actions for contributing to the energy transition of ASEAN countries by sharing the wisdom and expertise or experiences of developed countries with full consideration of the reality of this region. And number two, Japan has deeply engaged in a joint credit mechanism, JCM, greenhouse gas emissions reduction mechanism that will utilize a market mechanism. Because the developing countries have different costs of reduction, CO2 emissions, JCM is an efficient way of reducing emissions beneficial for both developing countries. Currently, Japan is now expanding the number of JCM partner countries, which is currently at 22, aiming of increasing the number of partners countries to 30 by 2025. For recent example, Japan has reached the signing of MOU with Senegal and Tunisia in August, and with Azerbaijan, Moldova, and Georgia in September. The AT and JCM are main engine to transform ASEAN countries to net zero emission area. By further enhancing actions, including AT and JCM, and by actively promoting the decarbonization, taking the ASEAN countries' reality into account, we hope to realize the ASEAN Net Zero and Zero Emission Committee, AZEC. That is the concept of the Prime Minister Kishida announced as his key theme in his policy agenda. And number three is the importance of the sharing the concept of mitigation contribution, which was also discussed in the previous session, panel 2. If a company diffuses the air conditioners with the heat pumps in developing countries and replaces the gas heating systems, it will lead to the emission reductions in those countries. But at present, there is no evaluation methodology to properly evaluate such efforts. If the contribution of mitigation is appropriately recognized as a value, then the resources such as finance will be mobilized toward those entities with high contributions, and the diffusion of the green products and services will be promoted, and the economic growth will lead to emission reduction. For developing countries, the diffusion of green products will benefit to reducing their own emissions, while for the developed countries, it will benefit for their economy or businesses. And the fourth point is about the adaptation businesses. As I explained earlier, the effects of climate change becoming an everyday's matter. We need to strengthen not only the mitigation measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also adaptation measures to cope with climate change that is already occurring. Japan has historically been exposed to the risk of weather disasters such as heavy rains, floods, and typhoons. Technologies have been developed to cope with such disasters to date. One example is the world's smallest and lightest compact weather radar technology. These radars can be installed in mountain areas where it has been difficult to install them in the past. It can detect local weather changes accurately and early. These technologies have already been introduced in Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, and other countries. Japan's advanced technology capabilities in disaster response is clearly beneficial for not only the enhancing resilience of the developing countries against disasters, but for the business itself, which is a win-win scenario for developing countries. Private and public dialogue with the developing countries in cooperation with international organizations will synergize the enhancement of such actions. These are just 4 points of international cooperation that will benefit both the developed and developing countries. We would like to continue to make united efforts to bridge developed and developing countries to achieve both emission reduction and economic growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we are running out of time, but let me try to summarize our discussion in 1 minute. So one thing that we noticed that there is already a cooperation among developed countries, as mentioned by Ms. Schubek. So that's one thing that we are for sure. And also as Mr. Bucket mentioned, that business sector can play an important role, promote cooperation between developed and developing countries through supply chains. So that's a very important role, and accountability is very important. And third, that there are different views on level playing field. So there is this idea of a carbon pricing approach and also the carbon intensity approach mentioned by Dr. Kopp and echoed by Mr. Aiba. So, and there is no one silver bullet. So we have to discuss more how we can make a good progress. And finally, we noticed that there are differences between the developed countries and the developing countries. So that means that there is a big difference in the marginal abatement cost, which actually brings up the opportunity for cooperation, like a joint crediting mechanism that is the Japanese government promoting, also Asian economic transition initiative. And those are the kind of the initiative that the Japanese government are working. And I think we have to come up with a win-win scenario that both developed and the developing countries can, gain benefit, and which includes actually not just mitigation, also adaptation is getting more important. And with that, I think we can achieve, green transformation. And with that, I would like to conclude our sessions. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining our panel. And please thank to all the excellent panelists.
Thank you very much, Professor Arimura, and all panelists. Thank you very much. We are coming to the end of the program. Let me introduce Mr. Hirohide Hirai, Vice Minister for International Affairs of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, for the closing remarks. Mr. Hirai, please.
So first, I would like to thank all of the participants for their great efforts and cooperation through the 2-week-long GX week, having this Global Green Transformation Conference as the last and final event. More than 140 countries have announced 2050 net zero emissions so far. Today, implementation and the actions to achieving these ambitious goals are becoming increasingly important. What the world needs now is to transform its social system into clean energy-driven system and achieve both emission reductions and economic growth. In Japan, we call this green transformation, or GX, and we are now working on a roadmap for its realization. With the participation of high-level participants from various countries and organizations, I am pleased that through today's discussion, we were able to deepen our understanding on unresolved issues such as how to design a green market,
What are the standards and evaluation that promote green products or services? And what is the way forward for international cooperation? I would like to reflect on some of the key points of today's discussion. In designing the green market, the importance of creating markets to achieve net zero emission was discussed. In particular, the importance of approaching and examining the issue from both the demand side and supply side was highlighted. In addition, a high-level ceremony named FMC in Japan was held, the first Asian event related to the Fast Movers Coalition. We show respect to the Mitsui OSK line as the first company to participate in FMC. In addition, to develop technologies for achieving net zero emission, the importance of the designing the market for transitional period was recognized. Through the concept of transition finance, we will attract global ESG funds and mobilize finance necessary for the technologies needed for transition. In the standards and the evaluation promoting green products and services, the concept of mitigation and contribution was discussed. The focus should not be only on the reduction of GHG emissions throughout the value chain of the certain entity, but also on how much a certain entity contributes to the mitigation. If the contribution of mitigation is appropriately recognized as a value, and the resources such as finance will be mobilized toward these entities with high contribution, the diffusion of green products and services will be promoted, and economic growth will lead to emission reduction. Active discussion related to this concept is already ongoing in the private sector, and we will support developing this concept from the policy side by building on and deepening our discussion on mitigation contribution. In the International Cooperation for Developing a Green Society session, the future direction of international cooperation was discussed. Various issues related to the global efforts in advancing climate policy were discussed. We reconfirmed the importance of promoting cooperation in a win-win manner for both developing and developed countries in international cooperation. Discussion was also deepened on the role of the industry and businesses in climate change and various trade measures to address carbon leakage. Considering the various positions of each country, we will continue to explore the way forward of promoting international cooperation so that developing countries can work together in unity. Finally, during the 2 weeks of the GX week, a very wide range of the issues were discussed for the realization of global GX. From specific topics such as the most advanced green technologies, including hydrogen and ammonia, to fundamental mechanisms of the society, such as finance and innovation. Japan will host the G7 presidency next year. Building on today's discussion, Japan will continue to lead the discussion toward the realization of global GX. I would like to conclude my remarks by thanking you all for your participation in the Global Green Transformation Conference. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hirai. This concludes the first Global Green Transformation Conference 2022. Thank you very much for your participation. Please cooperate with answering the questionnaire that we send out by email from the Secretariat. We wish you a good day or a good evening. Thank you very much.